If you betray me again, there won't be a second warning. That was the message on my phone, and I didn't even remember sending anything worth betraying anyone over. The rain came down hard enough to blur the city into streaks of white and gold, my windshield wipers struggling to keep up as I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I ever had in my life, knuckles pale, breath shallow, every red light feeling like a trap instead of a pause. And somewhere behind me, maybe 2 cars back, maybe closer, I had the unmistakable feeling I was being followed. The kind of feeling that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. The kind you don't question because your body already knows before your mind catches up. My phone buzzed again in the cup holder, the sound sharp in the silence, and I didn't need to look to know who it was. Adrian Blackwood, my boss. The man who signed my paychecks, who barely spoke above a calm, measured tone, who somehow knew when I was late before I even walked through the door, who noticed details no one else did. Like the fact I switched from almond milk to oat milk in my coffee without ever mentioning it. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself a lot of things back then. The traffic light ahead flickered yellow, and I hesitated for half a second too long before pressing the gas. My car slipping through just as it turned red, heart pounding as if I had done something far worse than breaking a traffic rule, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about traffic or weather or a long day at work. It was about that message. About the way his words didn't sound like a threat, not really. They sounded like a promise. 3 weeks earlier, everything had been normal. Or at least, I thought it was. I was just another assistant in a midtown office, juggling emails, scheduling meetings, trying to stay invisible in a place where everyone seemed sharper, faster, more certain than I felt. Adrian Blackwood had been the exception, not because he was loud or demanding. He wasn't, but because he didn't need to be. People moved when he entered a room without being told. Conversations shifted direction when he spoke. Even silence felt heavier around him, like it meant something. The first time he looked at me, really looked, I felt it like a physical thing, like stepping into cold air after being inside too long. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just observed, as if he were memorizing something about me I hadn't even figured out myself. "Emily Carter," he said, reading my name off a file I hadn't handed him yet, his voice low, steady, impossible to ignore. "You're more organized than your resume suggests." I laughed awkwardly, assuming it was a compliment, not realizing it was an assessment. Not realizing assessments had consequences. It started with small things. He'd call me into his office before I had a chance to knock. He'd reference conversations I hadn't had with him. He knew when I was about to make a mistake before I made it, correcting me with a quiet precision that should have reassured me, but didn't. It made me feel seen in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable, like standing under a spotlight I didn't remember stepping into. Still, I stayed. People didn't leave jobs like this. Not when rent was due. Not when student loans hovered like a permanent shadow. Not when opportunity came wrapped in a tailored suit in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. So I told myself I was imagining things. That his control was just competence. That his attention was just leadership. That the way his gaze lingered a second too long meant nothing at all. Until tonight. Until the message. Until I realized that whatever I thought this job was, whatever I thought he was, I had been wrong. And the worst part wasn't the fear tightening in my chest or the headlights behind me refusing to disappear. It was the quiet, undeniable truth settling in beneath all of it. I didn't know my boss at all. And somehow, he knew everything about me. I kept driving because stopping felt like surrender, and I did not even know what I would be surrendering to. The rain easing just enough for the streetlights to sharpen into something real again. My heartbeat still loud in my ears as I checked the rearview mirror for the 5th time in less than a minute. And there it was, the same dark sedan maintaining distance. Without getting closer, without falling back, just steady, patient, intentional. And that was what unsettled me the most because it felt planned, not random, not coincidence, not something I could explain away with a tired mind or an overactive imagination. And my phone buzzed again, a 3rd time now, the screen lighting up with his name like it owned the space, like it belonged there more than I did, Adrian Blackwood. And I finally glanced down for half a second longer than I should have, just enough to see the message preview before I locked the screen again. "Do not make this harder than it has to be." And something about that line made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore because it was not anger, it was not urgency, it was control, calm and deliberate, the kind that assumed I would listen, the kind that assumed I already understood the rules even though no one had ever explained them to me. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked into Blackwood Financial with a folder clutched to my chest and a plan that felt fragile but necessary. Get the job, keep the job, do not stand out, do not get noticed, survive long enough to build something stable, something predictable, something safe. And for the first few days, that plan worked. I blended in, I followed instructions, I learned quickly. I stayed late when needed and left quietly when I could, but Adrian was never part of the background. He was always the center, even when he stood at the edge of the room. And people reacted to him in ways I had never seen in a corporate office. Not fear exactly, but something close, something respectful and cautious and immediate, like they knew better than to question him even when he said very little. The first real crack in my version of normal came on a Tuesday afternoon when I forwarded a routine report to the wrong internal address. A simple mistake, something anyone could have done, and I caught it within seconds, already drafting an apology email before the system could even process the error. But before I could send anything, my phone rang, his direct line, not the assistant, not a department head, him. And I remember staring at the screen for a full second before answering because it did not make sense, not for something this small, not for someone at his level. Emily, he said, no greeting, no question, just my name. And somehow that was enough to make my stomach drop. The file you just redirected. He paused, not because he needed to think, but because he wanted me to. Do not attempt to correct it. I blinked, confused, my fingers still hovering over the keyboard. I can fix it right now. It has not been opened yet, I said, my voice careful, professional, trying to undo something that suddenly felt bigger than it should have. I know, he replied, calm, certain, and that certainty made something shift inside me. Leave it exactly where it is. That was the moment I should have asked questions, should have pushed back, should have done anything other than nod to myself and say, yes, of course, like it was a normal instruction, like it did not go against everything I had been trained to do. And when the call ended, I sat there staring at my screen, the sent message still visible, the recipient name unfamiliar, a department that did not exist on any internal directory I had access to. And for the first time, I felt it, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the quiet understanding that I was standing closer to something complicated than I had realized. Back in the present, the sedan behind me took the same turn I did, not rushing, not hiding, just following, and my grip on the wheel tightened again as I exhaled slowly, trying to think, trying to piece together how a single email, a single message, a single line from a man who barely raised his voice had brought me here, driving through a wet Manhattan night with a feeling I could no longer ignore. The feeling that I was no longer just an assistant trying to keep her job, I was part of. Something I did not understand, something that did not allow mistakes, something that did not forgive easily. And as another message lit up my phone without a sound this time, I did not need to read it to know what it said, because the meaning had already settled in, quiet and heavy and impossible to escape. I was not being followed by chance. I was being watched on purpose, and somehow, without realizing when it happened, I had crossed a line I could not see, but he could. The next turn came too fast, too smooth, like the city itself was guiding me somewhere I had not agreed to go. And when the sedan behind me followed again without hesitation, something inside me shifted from confusion to certainty. This was not random. This was not a coincidence. And whatever line I had crossed, I was already on the other side of it, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel as I forced myself to breathe slower, think clearer, because panic would not help me now, not when. Every move felt like it was already being anticipated by someone else, someone who did not need to rush, someone who had time on his side. And that thought alone made my chest feel tight, because Adrian Blackwood never rushed, not in meetings, not in decisions, not even in the way he looked at people. Everything about him was measured, deliberate, like every second had already been accounted for before it even happened. I took a right turn onto a quieter street, one lined with brownstones and dim porch lights, hoping the sudden change would shake whoever was behind me. But the headlights stayed, steady, unbothered, as if my decision had been expected. And that was when I realized something worse than being followed. I was being guided, nudged in a direction I did not understand yet. And my phone lit up again. Not a call this time, just a message. Short, precise, turn left at the next intersection, and my breath caught because it was not a suggestion. It was an instruction, the kind that assumed compliance, the kind that left no room for hesitation, and for a second, I considered ignoring it, considered speeding up, making another turn, doing anything unpredictable just to prove I still had control over something. Anything. But my hands did not move, because deep down, I knew this was already bigger than me, bigger than one wrong email or one late-night drive, and disobeying him now felt less like rebellion and more like stepping into something I could not see the end of. 3 weeks earlier, there had been another moment I should have paid attention to, another quiet shift I dismissed too easily. It was late, almost 9 in the evening, and most of the office had already cleared out, the kind of silence that made every keyboard click echo just a little louder, and I was finishing up a set of files he had asked for, double-checking everything because mistakes around him never felt small, even when they were, and I remember glancing at the clock, calculating how long it would take me to get home, what I would eat, how many hours of sleep I could still get before the next day. Started all over again, when his office door opened without a sound, and I looked up to see him standing there, jacket off, sleeves rolled just enough to show the clean lines of control in every movement he made. "You are still here," he said, not surprised, just noting it, like he had expected it all along, and I nodded, offering a small, polite smile. "Just finishing the reports you asked for," I replied, keeping my tone light. Normal, because everything around him felt like it required a kind of careful balance I was still learning, and he stepped closer, not too close, but close enough that I could feel his presence shift the air around me. "You corrected the numbers on page 4, he said, and my stomach dropped because I had noticed a minor discrepancy and fixed it without thinking twice, the way any competent assistant would. "Yes," I said slowly, unsure why that felt like the wrong answer, and his gaze held mine for a second longer than necessary, not angry, not approving, just evaluating. "Next time," he said quietly, "you do not change anything without telling me first." And it was not what he said, it was how he said it, calm, controlled, but absolute, like there was no version of reality where I would do otherwise again, and I nodded quickly. Of course, even though I did not understand why it mattered that much, even though part of me wanted to argue that I had only improved the report, made it more accurate, more presentable, but something in his expression told me accuracy was not always the point. Back in the present, the intersection approached, the streetlight casting a dull glow over the wet asphalt, and I slowed just enough to make the turn left. Exactly where the message had instructed, my heart pounding as I did something I never thought I would do. Follow his directions without question, without knowing where they would lead, and the moment my car straightened out, the sedan behind me did the same. No hesitation, no deviation, just confirmation, and another message appeared on my screen, softer this time, almost reassuring in its simplicity. "Good." And I exhaled shakily because that single word felt heavier than anything he had said before, heavier than the warning, heavier than the silence that always followed his instructions. And for the first time, I understood something I had been avoiding since the beginning. This was never just a job, and I was never just an assistant, because assistants did not get followed through the city at night. Assistants did not receive instructions like this. Assistants did not feel like every decision they made was already being watched, already being measured, already being judged, and as the road ahead stretched out into something darker and quieter than the streets I had left behind, I realized the truth I had been trying not to see. I was not trying to escape anymore. I was trying to understand, and that might have been the more dangerous choice. The road narrowed as I drove further, the city noise fading into something distant and hollow, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the glass and the quiet hum of my engine. And for the first time since this started, I noticed how empty everything felt. No pedestrians, no open storefronts, just long stretches of dim streetlights casting pale reflections on wet pavement, like I had crossed into a part of the city that did not belong to anyone else. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was exactly where he wanted me, isolated, contained, predictable. And the thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather. My phone stayed silent for almost a full minute, which somehow felt worse than the constant messages, because the silence meant he did not need to guide me every second. He trusted the pattern, trusted that I would keep following the path already set in motion, and that realization made my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because it meant this was not just about control. It was about certainty, his certainty that I would do exactly what he expected, and I hated how accurate that was becoming. Then the message came, simple, direct, pull over, and my breath caught as I glanced ahead, noticing the wide curb along a stretch of darkened buildings. No signs, no movement, just space, like it had been waiting for me, and I slowed without meaning to, my foot easing off the gas as my mind raced through every possible outcome, every possible mistake that could have led me here, and none of them made sense, not fully, not enough to justify this feeling, this quiet, pressing awareness that I was no longer in control of where this night was going. I pulled over. The engine idled, the headlights illuminating nothing but rain and empty sidewalk, and for a second, everything went still, no new message, no sound from behind me, just the soft ticking of my car and the distant echo of water hitting pavement, and I sat there gripping the wheel, waiting for something to happen, anything, because the waiting felt heavier than movement, heavier than fear, like the moment before a truth reveals itself whether you are ready or not. The car behind me stopped too. I did not need to turn to know that, but I did anyway, slow, cautious, my eyes catching the outline of the same dark sedan, parked a few yards back, headlights dimmed now, almost respectful, almost like it was giving me space, and that small detail unsettled me more than anything else, because it felt intentional, controlled, like every distance, every pause had been calculated. My phone lit up again. Stay where you are. Of course I would stay. I let out a quiet breath I had not realized I was holding, my fingers loosening slightly around the wheel, not because I felt safe, but because resisting no longer felt like an option, and that was the part one could not ignore, the part that settled deep in my chest with a quiet certainty. I was not here by accident, and I was not leaving until he decided I could. 3 weeks earlier, there had been a conversation I kept replaying in my head, one that did not make sense at the time but felt different now. Heavier, more deliberate. It happened in the hallway outside his office, brief, almost forgettable. I had been carrying a stack of files, focused on not dropping anything when he stepped into my path without warning, and I stopped short, the papers shifting in my hands as I looked up at him, surprised. You are learning quickly, he said, his voice calm, measured, like he was stating a fact rather than offering praise, and I blinked, unsure how to respond. Thank you, I said after a second, my tone polite, automatic, and his gaze lingered just long enough to make me aware of every small movement, every breath. But you are still making choices without understanding the consequences, he added, and the words caught me off guard because I did not know what choices he meant. I had followed every instruction, completed every task, stayed within every line I had been given. I am just doing my job, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to keep the moment light, manageable, and something shifted in his expression, not frustration, not amusement, something quieter, something that felt like a decision being made. That is what concerns me, he said, and then he stepped past me, leaving nothing behind but a sentence that did not belong in a normal conversation, not between a boss and an assistant, not in any world I understood at the time. Back in the present, the driver's side door of the sedan opened, slow, controlled, and my heart started pounding again, not fast, not chaotic, but heavy, deliberate, like it was preparing for something I could not see yet, and I watched as a figure stepped out, tall, composed, moving with a kind of quiet precision that felt familiar even from a distance, and I did not need to see his face to know who it was, because there was only one person who moved like that, only one person who turned silence into something that felt like control. And as he walked toward my car through the rain without hesitation, without urgency, I realized something I should have understood much earlier. He had never been reacting to me. He had been waiting for me to arrive. Exactly here, exactly like this, because in his world, nothing happened by accident, not mistakes, not choices, not even me. He stopped just outside my driver's side door, the rain tracing slow lines down his coat, as if it refused to touch him the way it touched everything else. And for a second I could not move, could not even breathe properly, because seeing him here, in this place, at this exact moment, made everything real in a way I had been avoiding since the first message, Adrian Blackwood was not just watching from a distance. He was here, standing close enough that I could see the calm in his expression, the same calm he carried into every meeting, every decision, every moment that required control, and somehow it felt more dangerous here, in the quiet, than it ever had in the office surrounded by people. He did not knock on the window. He did not rush me. He simply waited, like he knew I would open the door without being told. And I hated how right he was, because after a few seconds of silence, my hand moved on its own, unlocking the door with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. And when I pushed it open, the cold air rushed in, mixing with the tension already sitting heavy in my chest. "You should not have kept driving," he said, his voice low, steady, the same tone he used in the office. But here it carried something else, something more personal, more direct, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze even though every instinct told me to look away. I did not know what else to do. I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, but still holding enough strength to remind myself I was not completely powerless here, not yet. He studied me for a moment, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, just observing, like he was measuring something I could not see. And then he stepped slightly closer, not invading my space, but close enough that I could not ignore his presence. "You always have a choice," he said, and the words should have been reassuring, but they were not, because the way he said them made it clear that every choice had already been anticipated, already been accounted for, and the outcome never truly changed. 3 weeks earlier, I had believed choices were simple: follow instructions, complete tasks, avoid mistakes. But that belief started to fracture the day I was called into a meeting I was not supposed to attend. It was scheduled under a different department, one I had never interacted with, but somehow my name appeared on the access list, and I remember standing outside the conference room, hesitating for just a second before pushing the door open, because something about it felt wrong. The room was darker than usual, the blinds partially drawn, the atmosphere heavier, quieter, and when I stepped inside, the conversation stopped immediately, not abruptly, but deliberately, like it had never been meant for me to hear in the first place. Adrian was there, seated at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, and when his eyes met mine, there was no surprise, no confusion, just recognition, like he had expected me to walk in at that exact moment. "You are early," he said, and I glanced at the clock instinctively. Even though I knew the meeting time had not been mine to track. "I thought I was supposed to be here," I replied, my voice uncertain, and for a brief second, something shifted in the room. A glance exchanged between two men I did not recognize, a subtle pause that carried more weight than any spoken word, and Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "Then stay," he said simply, and that was it. No explanation, no correction, just permission, as if the situation had adjusted itself around me instead of the other way around. Back in the present, the rain softened slightly, the sound easing into a steady rhythm that made the silence between us feel sharper, more defined, and I realized I was still sitting in the car while he stood outside, completely unaffected by the discomfort of the moment, completely in control of how it unfolded, and that realization pushed something inside me, something small but necessary. "Why am I here?" I asked, the question leaving my lips before I could stop it, and for the first time since he approached, there was a pause in his response, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just a measured delay, like he was deciding how much I needed to know and how much I was ready to hear. "Because you crossed a line," he said finally, his voice just as calm as before, but the weight of the words settled differently now, heavier, more final, and I felt my pulse quicken again, not from fear alone, but from the realization that whatever line he was talking about, it was not something I could simply step back from, not something I could undo with an apology or a correction. And as he reached for the edge of the car door, holding it steady as if he had every right to, I understood. Something I had been avoiding since the beginning. This was not a misunderstanding, not a mistake that could be fixed. It was a turning point, and whatever came next, it was not going to return me to the life I thought I had just a few weeks ago. Because in his world, there was no going back, only forward, and forward meant deeper than I had ever intended to go. The word line echoed in my head long after he said it, like it carried more meaning than he was willing to explain, and I stayed where I was for a second too long, sitting halfway out of my car with the door open, the rain brushing against my sleeve as if it was urging me to move, to decide, to do something other than remain frozen between two versions of my life. One where I still believed this could be explained, and one where I already knew it could not, and the space between those two. Realities felt smaller by the second. He did not repeat himself. He did not tell me to get out. He simply held the door, steady, patient, like time was not a factor for him, like he had already waited long enough for me to reach this exact moment. And I realized that was the difference between us. I was reacting, trying to catch up, trying to understand, and he had been ahead of this from the beginning. Every step, every decision, every consequence already mapped out before I even realized there was a map. I stepped out of the car. The ground was slick beneath my shoes, the cold seeping through faster than I expected, but I barely noticed it because all my focus shifted to him, to the way he let go of the door only after I fully stood, to the way his attention stayed fixed on me without pressure, without force, just presence, and somehow that felt more controlling than anything else he could have done. What line? I asked, the question sharper this time, less uncertain, because if I was already here, already pulled into whatever this was, then I needed answers, even if I was not ready for them. And for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze drifting slightly past me, scanning the empty street like he was confirming something only he understood, and then it returned to me, steady, deliberate. The kind that changes what you are allowed to see, he said, and the words settled in a way that made my stomach tighten, because they did not clarify anything. They expanded everything, turning one question into 10 more I did not know how to ask. 3 weeks earlier, I had started noticing things that did not belong in a normal office, small details at first, easy to ignore if I chose to, but harder to dismiss once they started repeating. There were visitors who never signed in at the front desk, meetings that appeared on schedules without descriptions, files labeled in ways that did not match any department structure I recognized, and every time I got close to asking about it, something stopped me, not fear exactly, but awareness, the sense that the question itself might matter more than the answer, and that once I asked it, I could not take it back. The clearest moment came late one afternoon when I was organizing archive documents in a restricted folder I had only recently been given access to, a small promotion. They had called it a sign of trust, but trust felt like the wrong word now, because as I scrolled through the files, I noticed patterns that did not fit financial records, names repeated in different contexts, dates that aligned with news headlines I vaguely remembered, companies that did not exist publicly but appeared consistently across internal documents. And I remember pausing, my cursor hovering over one file in particular, something about it pulling my attention in a way I could not explain, and just as I clicked it open, the screen froze for a second before the document disappeared entirely, replaced by a blank page, and my breath caught because I knew I had not imagined it. I had seen something, even if it was only for a fraction of a second, and when my phone rang immediately after, his name lighting up the screen, I felt something shift inside me, something deeper than confusion, something closer to understanding. Emily, he said when I answered, his voice calm as always, but there was a subtle difference I could not ignore. Close the archive system, and I swallowed hard, glancing at the screen even though it was already empty, already corrected, already erased. It is already closed, I replied, and there was a pause on the other end, brief, measured, and then, good, he said, and that was it, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what I had seen or almost seen, just confirmation, like the moment had been handled exactly as intended. Back in the present, the rain softened even more, turning into a light mist that hung in the air rather than falling, and the silence between us shifted again, no longer waiting, but settling into something more defined, something that felt like a decision had already been made, even if I had not made it myself. You accessed something you were not meant to understand yet, he continued, his tone even, controlled. But there was something beneath it now, something quieter, something that felt less like authority and more like inevitability, and I felt my pulse pick up again, not from surprise, but from confirmation. This was not about a mistake, not about a single email or a wrong file. This had been building long before tonight, piece by piece, moment by moment, until it reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. I wrapped my arms slightly around myself, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was saying. Then why give me access at all? I asked, the question coming out steadier than I felt. Because if this had been avoidable, then why had it not been avoided? Why had I been placed exactly where I could see just enough to cross whatever line he was talking about? And his expression did not change, not immediately, but there was a shift in his eyes, subtle, almost unnoticeable if I had not been watching him so closely. Because I needed to know what you would do with it, he said, and the answer landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight. Because it meant this was never accidental, not my access, not my mistake, not even this moment. And as that realization settled in, slow and undeniable, I understood something that made everything else fall into place. I had not just crossed a line, I had been led to it. And now that I was here, there was no version of this where I could pretend I had not seen it. The word needed lingered longer than anything else he had said, settling into the space between us like it carried weight. I was only beginning to understand, and I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide if I had heard him correctly, if this was really what he meant, because needed did not sound like a mistake. It did not sound like an accident. It sounded intentional, precise. Like every step that led me here had been part of something planned long before I ever walked into that office, with a folder and a fragile sense of control. So this was a test, I said slowly, the realization forming as I spoke it out loud. And he did not correct me, which somehow felt like confirmation, his silence always more revealing than any explanation he could give. And I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, because if this had been a test, then I had already taken it without knowing. Already made choices without understanding the consequences he had warned me about weeks ago in a hallway I had almost forgotten. And I failed. I added, not as a question, but as an assumption, because that was the only version that made sense to me. The only reason I could imagine for being here, standing in the rain while my boss watched me like I had crossed into something irreversible. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to catch the light differently. And for the first time since this began, there was something almost like a shift in his expression, not soft, not warm, but less distant, less detached than before. No, he said, and the word was quiet, controlled, but firm in a way that made me pause, because it did not match what I expected. You did exactly what I expected you to do. The answer should not have surprised me, but it did, because it meant there was no version of this where I could have avoided it. No correct choice that would have kept me on the other side of whatever line he had drawn, and that realization changed something inside me, something small but significant, because it meant this was never about avoiding a mistake. It was about being pulled into a situation where every outcome led here. 3 weeks earlier, after that call about the archive system, I had tried to convince myself it was nothing, a technical glitch, a system error, something explainable if I looked at it the right way. But the feeling did not go away, the quiet awareness that I had seen something I was not supposed to, even if it had been erased almost immediately. And over the next few days, that awareness grew, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. I noticed the way certain emails never stayed in my inbox for long, the way certain conversations stopped when I entered a room, the way my access seemed to expand in areas that did not match my role while remaining restricted in others that should have been routine. And every time I considered asking about it, I heard his voice in my head, not the exact words, but the tone, the quiet certainty that questions had consequences I was not prepared to deal with. The moment everything shifted came on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day that usually felt lighter, easier, when people were already thinking about the weekend, but nothing about that day felt normal, not from the moment I walked in, because the atmosphere was different, heavier, more controlled. And I could not explain why, not until I saw him standing near the conference room, speaking to someone I did not recognize. His posture relaxed, his expression calm, but there was something in the way the other man held himself, something tense, something careful, like every word he chose mattered more than it should have. And as I walked past, trying not to draw attention, Adrian's gaze shifted to me. For just a second, just long enough to register my presence, and then back to the conversation. But that second was enough to make me feel like I had interrupted something I was never meant to see. Later that evening, as I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, no name, no context, just a single line. Be careful what you open next time. And my heart skipped because it did not feel random. It did not feel like a mistake. It felt like a warning, but not from him, not from Adrian, because his warnings were never vague, never unclear. They were direct, precise, impossible to misunderstand. And this felt different, uncertain in a way that made it more unsettling, because it suggested something else was watching, something else had noticed what I had seen, even if only for a moment. Back in the present, I wrapped my arms tighter around myself, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything connecting in a way I could no longer ignore. If I did what you expected, I said, my voice steadier now, more grounded in the reality unfolding around me. Then why am I here like this? And he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the sedan behind me before returning, as if acknowledging something without needing to explain it. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. Because you are no longer the only one who noticed, he said, and the words settled heavier than anything else, because they changed the situation entirely, turning this from something contained, something controlled, into something broader, something I could not predict, and I felt my pulse quicken again, not from confusion this time, but from clarity, because for the first time since this started, I understood the real reason I was here. Not punishment, not consequence, but protection. And as that realization took hold, slow and undeniable, I looked at him differently, not just as my boss, not just as the man who controlled everything around him, but as the only person standing between me and something I still could not fully see, and that might have been the most dangerous realization of all. The word protection did not feel safe the way it should have. It did not bring relief or comfort. It settled into my chest like a warning wrapped in something quieter, something heavier, because protection meant there was something to be protected from, something already in motion, something that had seen me just as clearly as he had. And the thought made my breath slow in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, like I was trying to match his pace without realizing it. I looked past him for a second, toward the sedan parked a few yards away, its presence no longer just unsettling but purposeful, part of something structured, something organized. And when my gaze returned to him, I noticed the shift again, not in his posture, not in his tone, but in the way he watched me now, less like he was evaluating and more like he was confirming, like something had already been decided, and this moment was just the acknowledgement of it. Protection from who? I asked, the question leaving my lips before I could soften it, because there was no reason to pretend anymore, not when I was already standing in the middle of something I could not step away from. And he did not answer immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make me aware of every sound around us. The faint hum of a distant car, the soft rhythm of water dripping from the edge of a building, the quiet space that seemed to exist only for this conversation. And then he spoke, his voice just as calm as before, but carrying a weight that felt different now, more direct, more final. From the people who do not make the same distinction I do, he said, and the words settled slowly, forcing me to think about what distinction meant in his world, what line he was choosing to draw when others might not. And the realization came in pieces, not all at once, but enough to understand the shape of it, enough to know this was not just about me anymore. 3 weeks earlier, I had received another message, one I tried to ignore at first because acknowledging it felt like giving it power, but the more I thought about it, the harder it became to dismiss. It came late at night, long after I had left the office, after I had convinced myself the day had ended like any other, and my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. No name, no context, just a line that made my chest tighten the moment I read it. You are looking in the wrong places, and I remember staring at the screen for a long time, trying to decide if it was meant for me, if it was some kind of mistake, but something about it felt too precise, too intentional, like it had been sent with a purpose I could not yet see. And I did what anyone would do. I ignored it, told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, that not everything needed to mean something more. But the next day, when I walked into the office, the feeling followed me, subtle but persistent, like I was being watched from somewhere I could not identify. It showed up in small ways at first, a glance that lingered a second too long, a conversation that ended when I approached, a door that closed just before I reached it. And I told myself it was normal, that I was imagining patterns where none existed. until it stopped feeling like imagination and started feeling like awareness, like I was moving through a space where I did not fully understand the rules, where I did not know who was paying attention or why. And that was the part that stayed with me, the not knowing, the quiet uncertainty that made every step feel slightly off balance. Back in the present, I shifted my weight slightly, the damp pavement cold beneath my shoes, grounding me in a moment that no longer felt distant or unreal. And I met his gaze again, more steadily this time, because if this was the truth of it, then I needed to face it directly. And your distinction is? I asked, the question measured, controlled, even though my pulse had not fully settled, and there was a pause, brief but deliberate, before he answered, like he was choosing the exact words he wanted me to hear. That you are not a liability, he said, and something in the way he said it changed the meaning entirely, because it was not just a statement, it was a decision, one he had already made before this conversation even began. And I felt that realization settle deeper than anything else tonight, because it meant my place in this was already defined, already understood in a way I had not been part of deciding. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts catching up to what he was saying, to what he was not saying, and to the space in between. And if they disagree? I asked quietly, because that was the part that mattered now, the part that turned this from a conversation into something real, something immediate. And his expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something sharper, more focused, like the answer to that question had never been uncertain. Then they are wrong, he said, and the certainty in his voice left no room for anything else. No hesitation, no doubt, just a clear line drawn in a world I was only beginning to see, and for the first time since this started, I understood the full weight of what protection meant when it came from someone like him. It was not soft, it was not gentle, it was absolute. And as that realization settled in, steady and unavoidable, I felt something shift inside me again. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when you realize the person standing in front of you is not just offering protection, he is claiming responsibility, and in his world, that meant something far more permanent than I was ready to accept. Responsibility was not a word that should have felt heavier than protection, but somehow it did, settling into my chest in a way that made everything else shift around it. Because protection could be temporary, conditional, something that changed depending on circumstances, but responsibility sounded permanent, like a decision that did not get undone once it was made. And I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, trying to understand what that meant for me, for him, for whatever. This had become without my permission. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving behind a quiet dampness in the air, the kind that made the city feel paused instead of alive, and I realized how far removed this moment was from everything I thought my life was just a few weeks ago, how distant. That version of me felt now, the one who believed a job was just a job, that effort led to stability, that following rules meant staying safe. And I almost laughed at the thought, not because it was funny, but because it was naive in a way I could not return to. You do not get to decide that alone, I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected, because if he was claiming something, if he was defining my place in this without asking me, then I needed to remind him that I was still here, still capable of making my own choices, even if they felt smaller now, even if they felt like they were being watched before I made them. For a second, there was silence again, but this time it felt different, less like waiting and more like acknowledgement, like he had expected that response, like it fit into whatever understanding he already had about me. And his gaze did not waver, did not harden. It simply stayed, focused, deliberate. I already did, he said, and the certainty in his voice was not forceful, it was not aggressive. It was something else entirely, something that did not require agreement to be real, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, because it meant this was not a negotiation, not in the way I understood it. 3 weeks earlier, there had been one final moment I ignored, one final sign that everything was moving towards something I did not yet see. It happened the same day I received the second message, the one about looking in the wrong places, and I had stayed late again, trying to distract myself with work, trying to convince myself that routine could still ground me, that normal tasks could still feel normal if I focused hard enough. And I remember packing up my bag, shutting down my computer, going through the motions of leaving like any other night, until I reached the lobby and saw something that did not belong. A black car parked directly outside the building. Engine running, driver waiting, not for anyone specific, not that I could tell, but the timing felt too precise, too aligned with my own exit to be coincidence, and I paused just inside the glass doors, watching it for a moment longer than necessary, telling myself it was nothing, just another car, just another driver, just another part of a city that never really stopped moving. And then my phone buzzed again, his name appearing on the screen, and when I answered, his voice was exactly the same as always, calm, controlled, like everything was exactly where it should be. "You are still at the office," he said, not asking, just stating, and I felt that familiar shift inside me. The awareness that he knew more than he should, more than made sense. "I am leaving. Now," I replied, glancing back at the car without meaning to, and there was a pause on the other end, brief but intentional. "Do not take a ride tonight," he said, and I frowned slightly, confused by the instruction, because it seemed unnecessary, out of place. "I was just going to call one," I admitted, and his response came immediately, sharper than usual, not louder, but more defined. "Walk," he said, and then the line went quiet. Back in the present, the memory settled into place with everything else, connecting in a way that made it impossible to ignore, because it meant he had seen this coming long before I had, long before any of this felt real to me. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not just at the control he carried, not just at the certainty in his voice, but at the intention behind it, the pattern that had been there from the beginning, guiding me, redirecting me, keeping me just close enough to the truth without letting me fall too far into it alone. "So what happens now?" I asked, and this time the question felt different, less like resistance, less like fear, and more like acceptance, not of him, not completely, but of the situation I was already in, the one I could not step out of even if I tried. He held my gaze for a second, and then another, the silence stretching just enough to make the moment feel deliberate, like a line being drawn without words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, but no less certain. "Now you stay where I can see you," he said, and the simplicity of it made everything else fall quiet, because it was not a request, not a suggestion, it was a boundary, one that came with an understanding I could not ignore. And as I stood there in the aftermath of everything that had changed in just one night, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning. I was not standing outside his world anymore. I was already inside it, and the only difference now was that I finally knew.